It's my pleasure to introduce tonight's keynote speaker, Professor Kofi Boone, a fellow in the American Society of Landscape Architects. Kofi Boone is a university faculty scholar and professor in the Department of Landscape Architecture and Environmental Planning at NC State University in the College of Design. He is a Detroit native and a graduate of the University of Michigan. His work resides in the overlap of landscape architecture and environmental justice with specializations in democratic design, digital media, and interpreting cultural landscapes. He serves on the board of directors of the Core Network, as well as the Landscape Architecture Foundation, where he is currently president-elect. Professor Boone's presentation tonight is titled The Commons, Land, Property, Information, and Landscape Agency. And I believe we'll have time for questions after the lecture. But I also wanted to mention that that very low-res image behind me is the only photo I could find from the 1971 Wabash. So I would like to have you join me in welcoming with a virtual hand clap, Professor Kofi Boone.
Thank you. Thank everybody for a really gracious introduction. Seeing the clapping in the chat, that's, I guess, a 21st century thing, but I'll take it. I first want to salute the students for your perseverance. I want to echo the comments about the difficulties and the challenges that we've all faced, including the twin pandemics, which we're still dealing with. And without your perseverance and your will to move forward, we would be worse off. So I salute you. I salute the students who helped organize this conference. Very thankful. Also thankful for the intro music, The Roots. So before I get into the topic, let me just say that I started my MLA career at Michigan in 1992. And for many of us who were into hip hop, it was one of the greatest years in hip hop history because on the same day, A Tribe Called Quest Midnight Marauders came out on the same day as Wu-Tang Clan's Enter the 36 Chambers. And how this relates to you is that instead of going to the studio and staying up all night working on a project, there was a record store in town that had a Midnight Madness sale. And so we were in there waiting to get our first copies of these two classic albums. And lo and behold, at 1 a.m., my design professor comes walking into the store. And he looks at me and I look at him and then he walks out. And then the next day he's doing our mid-semester reviews and he goes, well, I don't know whether or not to give you an A or to fail you. And I was like, well, what? And he was like, yeah, you're supposed to be in studio working all the time. What were you doing at the record store? And I kind of went, what were you doing at the record store at 1 a.m.? So that's indicative of that period of time. So I'm glad that the culture is moving forward and we can celebrate great music and great hip hop culture together. I'm going to ask permission to share my screen now and begin. The Commons, and so this is an extension of current work I'm doing with my colleague and good friend Julian Edgemont at Tufts, looking at these potentials of us to pool and share resources, and now reflecting on landscape architecture and its role in that. And as a part of that, it will identify opportunities to link it to history, to culture, and of course, to continue that effort to diversify what we think of as the canon of landscape architecture. So thank you for being a part of that. I also want to echo the acknowledgements that were extremely well done by the students. So I support that as well. But I will let you know that I'm coming to you from the land of the Eno and the Saponi and the Shakori and many others, and ask permission on this ground to deliver these words and to recognize the legacy that we are built upon. But I'm also coming to you from the Southeastern United States. And so we deal either overtly or covertly with the legacy of race every day where we are in the South. This is one of the earliest census maps in the United States. It shows by county in 1860 the percent of enslaved African population across what were formerly the Confederate States. I know it's small and it's grainy, but the thing to pay attention to is the Black areas, which literally are the highest concentrations. And in some ways, this is a geography map as well, and a geology map, which is to say, those occurred in the places with the most arable soils. So geology, racial equity, all of them are mixed in to where we are. And I've identified where we are in North Carolina in that map. So those two form the foundations of some of these comments that you'll hear today. that we occupy, in some cases stolen land, and in some cases have profited from stolen labor. And I want to commend ASLA and Landscape Architecture magazine for creating space to talk about the most recent manifestations of these, the twin pandemics, of course, COVID, and also the racial reckoning and the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd last summer. And we're all anxiously watching the current court cases and trying to see what happens moving forward. And there was a time when we had to make the case that some of these issues were connected to our environment and that they were worth these high levels of conversation. I think we're moving past that, and it's getting to what are we going to do about it? And so now we're at that point, and I hope this moves it forward. For those who may know who I am, some of it might have to do with the article on the left and the book on the right. Black Landscapes Matter, which was a conference that Walter Hood convened at Berkeley about 3 years ago. So predating a lot of the issues that are on the front burner of things right now. And he made a call in response to the anniversary of the insurrections in LA after Rodney King incident, which in our generation is the equivalent to the George Floyd incident view, and has reflected how far have we come and how much further do we need to go. And so to the Berkeley students, if there's anybody in Berkeley in the audience, I want to say thank you. Most of the time as academics, when we write, it goes into a journal and it sits on the shelf. No one ever reads it. But in this case, it really did have some currency, and that's because of you all. And so thank you for that. And of course, Walter's great book, which came out this year, which is already in its third printing, that deals with a lot of these issues, particularly with his work. Before we dive into the commons, just a recovery of some of those themes. The Black Landscapes Matter piece was meant to lay some foundations and some frameworks from which to move, but it was really about looking at our legacy in landscape architecture through the lens of the co-founders of the Black Lives Matter movement. And Alicia Garza, who's one of those individuals, made a really eloquent statement that I think is translatable to what we do every day when we think about built environments. The idea of being seen, so that there are many stories and many perspectives and many lived experiences that we often don't acknowledge in public space and in our work. So that challenge of making that visible. To live with dignity, a word that, having grown up in the North, didn't hear very often, but in the South, you hear it all the time. So the idea of having an affirming experience, something that recognizes your legacy and history and value as a person, is very important, and is something that we can pursue through landscape architecture. And of course, the last one, to be connected. And as a sort of superficial example, all of us together on Zoom, exchanging information, building ideas together, but we have the ability through the places that we make to enable that. So those were marching orders of how do we look at the legacy of landscape architecture, particularly from the African-American or the Black cultural experience through that lens. And for that reason, we start before the founding of the United States. And I'll just at a high level talk about some of the ideas that came through that African-Americans, particularly enslaved Africans, were integral to the foundations of what we think about landscape architecture today. This is a view of Middleton Place Plantation outside of Charleston, South Carolina. Charleston, of course, made most of its wealth through rice production, but they were unable to really scale it up and figure out how to turn it into a cash crop until they knew and learned that the Wolof people of Senegal and West Africa have been engineering rice plantations for centuries in West Africa. And also many had the sickle cell anemia trait, which in some ways gave them some protection from malaria, which plagued that whole part of the country at that time. And so we often think of the legacy of slavery as being just laborers from the continent of Africa that didn't have any intellectual or creative content. But in fact, they were specifically selected because of their ability to do what we now think of as landscape architecture: grade the land, regulate the water, produce crops for production. And so we celebrate the butterfly lakes, the terraces, the first camellia planted in the continental United States, rightfully so. But this is also an opportunity for us to celebrate that even under great duress, the ingenuity and creativity of African people infused one of our earliest landscapes. And this is not just confined to Middleton Place, it's many places. We celebrated that after Reconstruction and the eruption of Black towns and African Americans and people of African descent founding communities all over the country and doing all the things that we associate with architecture, urban planning, urban design, and landscape architecture. And one of them is in our own backyard, Princeville, North Carolina, about an hour east of Raleigh, which is the oldest African-American community founded by freed African-Americans. There's 3 that are about the same timeline: Eatonville, Florida, Mound Bayou, Mississippi, but Princeville, formerly known as Freedom Hill, was there. And so that was an important legacy that is not celebrated in the canon of landscape architecture, the ability for people to actually build from scratch new communities and towns with challenges, which we'll discuss more frequently. And of course, institution building, and the idea that, again, after Reconstruction and during Jim Crow, Black folks and African Americans couldn't attend the same university as white people. And so historically, Black colleges and universities emerged as important reservoirs of information, of creativity, of talent, and of impact, even today. So Kamala Harris, alumni of the university that's on this screen, Howard University, and whose grounds was in part designed by David Williston, the first formally trained Black landscape architect, believe from Cornell, so salute to that. Native of Fayetteville, North Carolina, so we'll take credit for that too. But the idea that institution building was also a part of this process, and how we don't include historically Black colleges, universities, religious institutions, and other places in the canon of landscape architecture, and we should. In sum total, it was attempting to make the case that from a cultural perspective, and what's relevant today is that landscapes aren't just about ecological function, they're not just about beauty, but they have the ability to enable political and economic power, and the ability for communities to express themselves and pass things along sustainably. We had a forum about a year ago. It's sad that we're still on Zoom, but the anniversary of Juneteenth coming up soon, we pulled together a panel, thankful to Land 8 and Inova again for this particular one, dealing with issues of equity and justice, and had the chance to invite friends and colleagues to participate in this conversation. Similar themes to what you're exploring today. Fred Brown, CEO of the Forbes Funds in Pittsburgh, we talked about the philanthropic contribution and the economics of change and how to make those more equitable. Vernice Miller Travis, one of the mothers of the environmental justice movement, founder of We Act in Harlem, and really talking about the environmental justice component. Breeze Outlaw, great designer at Sasaki, and also one of our distinguished alumni, who they really talked about the need to be inclusive and to think about a wide array of people when we deal with spaces. And I was just there for window dressing, but it was a great conversation. In it, we talked about the ability to use that event, not just to have a conversation, but to mobilize. And at that time, ASLA was still going through the CEO search, and there was the need to develop a new strategic plan. And what we're really happy with Tori at being selected, having earned that well through that process and initiating the strategic planning process that puts issues of racial equity front and center. So we salute those changes that came out of that piece. Accreditation. So how can we think about rewarding schools and providing pathways for schools to create curricular pathways to explore these issues in depth, right? Salute to Chris Pritchard and that whole crew, the education committee, for they're still in the process of refining it, but moving forward on placing issues of justice and equity squarely in the curriculum, not an elective, but something that is included as we start to think about what's a part of our canon and what's not. Since then, the Black Landscape Architect Network has been formalized. So the excellent work of Glenn Smith and Mark Miller and many of the other board members to translate this informal network to a formal one. And really glad that they're a part of your Labash session as well. And between organizations, as a member of Landscape Architecture Foundation, have had the privilege of assisting our CEO, Barbara Deitch, and Rachel Boer, and many others to facilitate a conversation between all the organizations associated with landscape architecture on what we are now calling the journey map. This is a diagram on the screen that was created by Jacinda Walker, African-American graphic designer, who was trying to identify gaps from a graphic design standpoint for Black and BIPOC students to move through from the discovery phase of finding out their professions out there through influence. So the ability to move through successfully that profession and then recycle that energy and invest it in the next generation. And we have used this diagram, adopted it as a way to facilitate really high-level conversations between ASLA, ourselves, CLAR, many others who are participating. And this is just a reminder to some folks, there's some post Bash events on April 22nd at 6 p.m. There'll be an opportunity to engage with people from the President's Council and understand this journey map and what that may mean for us. What can we do to build stronger foundations, K through 12? Proficiency, what can we do in the academy to make sure that the skill sets you're learning are timely and connected to these issues? Workforce, opportunities for employment and movement and promotion through those ways. And then, of course, influence, moving to the academic realm where I am now and other places. So we're really excited about the use of this diagram to facilitate some great conversations that are producing some results already. But we come back to the issues of the day, and we still mourn the loss of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and many others, and the outpouring that formed the racial reckoning many years ago. And we struggle still with what does that really mean for the future of landscape architecture. And something that we've talked about before at other sessions, but wanted to bring to your attention is George Floyd was from Houston. And not just from Houston, he went to Jack Yates High School. And we'll talk about Jack Yates in a second, but it's tied to an event that's important to African-American culture and really American culture called Juneteenth. Juneteenth recognizes the 2-year gap between when African-Americans in Texas were legally free due to the Emancipation Proclamation, but didn't find out until 2 years later that they were free. And so this becomes a major national holiday. It's like, look, we're free. We're so free that we need to move forward and talk about celebrating and gathering in place to do that. And Houston became one of the most important places for that. Jack Yates, a prominent reverend of a powerful church in Houston at the time, and a few others, purchased land, which eventually became known as Emancipation Park, a landscape that is specifically dedicated to celebrating Juneteenth. What's interesting about it is the first public park in Houston. Their purchase and ownership of this landscape to celebrate this ritual precedes Houston's growth and development and generation of other parks. And so in some cases, when we talk about the exclusion of different stories and the low numbers of different people in our profession, it's not for the lack of people moving and developing in these places. There are other connections that need to be made, but it places a premium which has moved forward about land ownership, control, and the ability to conduct those rituals and those lifeways on that land. There's a very old picture of the group of people that pooled their money communally for the purchase of Emancipation Park. It's an amazing piece. And it recently got a renovation. And the designer of that renovation, rest in peace, a good friend when he was alive, Phil Freelon, who was at Perkins and Will when I got to know him, but was a part of the Freelon group at this time. The architect of the Smithsonian Museum of African-American History in Washington, D.C. This was one of the legacy projects that he left as a part of that. But also tapping into local cultural traditions. And so in the Black Landscape Architects article, Landscapes Matter article as well, we talked about how in some cases, culturally, landscape architecture can be isolated from other artistic traditions where there's a lot of creativity and energy in different groups, particularly Black communities. But in Houston, we know the legacy of John Biggers, right? Who a lot of his paintings and artwork really depicted what we now call the shotgun house, which is the form that you see in these pictures. The shotgun house is a derivative of a housing type that was brought by African Americans to North America from Haiti, right? And moving through New Orleans and then disseminating throughout the Southeast. So even here, there's a reference to the impact on architecture and landscape captured in art, which inspired the work of Rick Lowe, right? MacArthur Fellow, who developed Project Row House, a community development corporation, as an attempt to sort of circle the energy around the restoration and protection of this unique form, but activating it with ritual, with music, with art, and with other elements, which you can see depicted here. Rick will tell you himself that the frustration was at the time, it wasn't a valued place. It was in disrepair, it got value, but it wasn't enough to defend it from what we now know as gentrification and displacement. The idea that this became so valuable that developers and other folks came in and in some cases displaced existing residents. And so that's one of the challenges coming out of this is our role in all of this. Many of us are learning the tools and the skills to define and build landscapes, but we need to build a broader skill set that helps us understand social, cultural, and economic issues. and acknowledge the fact that investments in public space, be it a street, a plaza, a park, has an impact on adjacent private property values. And there was a period of time when we could just say, oops, we didn't know that, but we know that now. And so how do we start to use our skill set and our tool set to increase sustainability, particularly helping people stay in place to benefit from the pieces that we make? With regards to Black and Brown communities, we still are struck with the wealth gap, which is sort of a component that influences people's ability to dedicate the time to generate these skills, to get this knowledge and to be able to practice it. From $122,000 for the white household to just over $1,200 in household wealth for Black and Brown families. You can see that huge disparity. And so when we talk about in the United States, a corporate structure that places economic value on land and favors private development, which enables us to do our work, right? Pays our bills and allows us to work, that there are these huge disparities that start to explain why some folks don't participate and some do. All of this led to a reflection from Julian and myself. Julian, urban planning professor from Tufts University and renowned scholar on global sustainability, to reflect on the past, to see if that can help us point to the future. There's a term from Ghana, West Africa, where I used to teach a study abroad course, the Akan language, Sankofa, right, which is an Adinkra symbol, which resembles a bird looking backwards, but moving forwards. So the idea that you can't know your future unless you know your past. So we decided to look at this idea of common, the commons, a shared resource that builds strength and enables individuals within that group to move forward, but through collective sharing. And it's popular, right? It's dealt with when we talk about systems of mutual aid today, or other systems that we've used to kind of get through the twin pandemics. It echoes that, but there's a deep, deep tradition in Black and African-American culture of use of these. So this gets into the ideas of what would it mean if some of our work helped enable cooperative ownership of land, of property, of information, which we'll get to towards the end of the presentation. How does that impact our definition of wealth? Expand it from just the purely economic to issues of health, to issues of well-being, of broader categories of what we consider wealth. And then also, how does it build environmental equity as we start to evolve our ethics as professional landscape architects? Equity and justice are central to the way that we move forward. And just as a baseline, not to endorse it, this is the definition from Environmental Protection Agency of what environmental equity means. And so equity has been co-opted as a term to deal with economics, so you're dealing with your stocks and your investments. But in this case, it's really talking about distribution of risk and a distribution of benefit. That's environmental. So we want to use that as sort of a leaping off point. And to get to some of these measures, there are different measures for how to do that. No one's really agreed on it, right? There's no consensus right now on who is really defining this well. So it's a great opportunity for discovery and for innovation. This comes from my colleague, Fred Brown in Pittsburgh, who I referenced before, who has been trying to build return on investment measures based on the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Right. So the idea of a goal is to eliminate poverty, no poverty. Right. So in his work, he's figured out a metric in terms of you pay $1 in, you get $5 back in terms of providing stability and basic needs for folks. Right. These are people who don't need to go to emergency rooms or aren't reliant on emergency food and shelter resources. Lifelong learning, community renewal, like all of these are terms that we know, but in terms of really foregrounding them, making them prominent as we execute our projects and think about landscapes, it's not common knowledge now. So we have many guides, but he's one of them. We have many barriers to overcome, right? So where I am in the South, there's a real thing called racialized topography. It's a geographic term coined by Ewan and Wharf in 2005. And they did an analysis of about 100 southeastern cities to see if they could correlate race and altitude, what we would call elevation. And except on the coast and very valuable landscapes, you could predict race and altitude. Higher ground, predominantly white, lower ground in valleys, predominantly Black and brown. Well, why would that be true? A lot of these southern towns were founded during the period of enslavement and the period of Jim Crow. particularly enslavement, where African Americans and other people couldn't even own property or live within the boundaries of established cities. And so some of this is a time commentary, but what it does do, and this is the case of Raleigh, Raleigh's capital was established on the ridgeline between the Crabtree and Walnut Creeks, was that when emancipation came, Civil War ended, Reconstruction started, freedmen's land, which is a term used particularly for African Americans for the first land available, was in the low-lying areas. And so Rochester Heights, ironically named, was in the Walnut Creek Valley. And so across the Southeast, this puts Black communities that have historical significance at risk, simply because of where they are and because of exclusive land rights and properties. And it's a major, major issue that permeates a lot of our thinking. These are images from Hurricane Floyd, which did incredible harm to residents of Southeast Raleigh moving forward. And as we come up on the 200th birthday of this gentleman, Frederick Law Olmsted, a hero of many, we have to think critically about how decisions that we've made in landscape architecture have resulted in the displacement of communities, particularly Black and Brown communities. So Frederick Law Olmsted, of course, abolitionist, under a pen name, wrote for what became the New York Times about the deplorable conditions in plantations in the South leading up to the Civil War, travels to Europe and gets inspired by royal grounds being opened up for public use to civilize people. Those are his words. Specifically brought that back to the United States and really pioneered in some ways, not invented, but pioneered how we think about public space and landscape architecture for years to come. And for people who don't think landscape architecture is political, I would encourage you to read about Frederick Law Olmsted, a very political figure. Central Park, which was done by Olmsted and Vaux, which was conceived by Andrew Jackson Downing a generation earlier, the rural park in the city when New York City had not really grown yet. So New York City more or less ended at the southern boundary of Central Park, except in the footprint of Central Park, there was a community. That community was called Seneca Village. We'll talk about that in a second. This is a great book if you're interested in equity and justice in the landscape. It's written by Dorceta Taylor, and she's recovering sort of the growth and the emergence of the mainstream environmental movement. She looks at it with a critical eye, asking why that didn't, at its inception, include the issues of women, people of color, of people across class divides. Why did it diverge and perceived as elite? And why did this parallel movement, which eventually became environmental justice, occur? And she traces it back to the urbanization of the United States, and she uses Central Park as a case study. So Andrew Jackson Downing dreams up the rural park in the city. Generation later, Olmsted and Vaux executed, but there were competing ideas at the time. Through her research, she identified papers that talked about sanitation groups, women's groups, organizations that weren't unions, but were organizations of laborers and others. And they were more interested in having a dispersed set of parks, say a series of central parks, plural, that were integrated into the existing living places of people. Similar to the strategies we think of now as we start to retrofit our environments, in part in response to the twin pandemics, but also preceding that. That competing set of ideas was defeated politically for the rural park in the city, which has had produced many benefits, but it's the idea that that wasn't the only way that people were thinking about it. And this is over 100 years ago. People were thinking in similar ways, but because of politics, their ideas were defeated. And I enjoy the sheep's meadow as much as anybody. It emulates, it's been mimicked all over the country and all over the world, but it came at the expense of an existing community self-built by African Americans, between 500 and 700 people. Until recently, there was no recognition of it. Add insult to injury, Frederick Olmsted never hired Black laborers to even build his projects. And so not only were people displaced, they couldn't even get economic recourse with that. Federal policies, which are still trying to repair from the mid-century. So this is my hometown. I have a gray beard, but this is not a picture that I know. This is before I was born. Hastings Street, the business district of Black Bottom in Detroit. Black Bottom because, again, because of the soil, later became the place for African Americans to congregate, declared a slum and therefore eradicated through freeways. And this pattern, right, and I'm sure that many of our professions were involved with this, right? Engineers, architects, landscape architects, everyone. over 60 cities around the United States, where they now analyze that many of these freeways targeted Black communities because of their designation. The defining characteristic, not the deterioration of the physical environment, but the percent African American, which is also what led to redlining. Redlining, the HOLC, Homeowners Loan Corporation, conducted a survey in over 60 American cities in the early 20th century to determine the viability of communities for investment and to allow people to borrow money to either purchase homes or to improve their properties. They did what we now will call a windshield survey. They scanned these places from streets and made assessments about the qualities of them. And they gave them a grade. Like if you were in the green zone, you were a safe investment, a safe bet, right? So they recommended you get resources for either home buying or for investing in your businesses. If you were in red, though, you were considered hazardous, and that was a no investment zone, right? The number one identifying characteristic of the red line was percent African American, not the quality of the built environment. And these policies led to generational inequalities, where parts of communities were actively invested in, others were left to disrepair. There's a great book called The Color of Law by Rothstein, if you want to know more of the ins and outs of how that works. And this has compounded on many of the factors that deal with life expectancy, health, and other concerns. So the red line areas are also in many cities, in this case, Los Angeles, the areas with the lowest life expectancies, the areas with the lowest potentials for getting out of poverty, right? So state of California, about 81 years is the life expectancy because of generational disinvestment and disturbance. The census tracts labeled red are in the 74 years one, so 7 years tied to generational inequality. This comes to us from Robert Wood Johnson, Life Expectancy by Zip Code. Believe it or not, that's a real thing. With regards to African Americans as well in Black culture, these are urban examples, but it happened in rural places as well. This map shows land loss. This came up recently. If you look at the American Rescue Plan, Black farmers in particular were celebrating because as a part of that, there was a large earmark for agriculture. And there's $5 billion associated with issues of land loss. What is land loss? Well, African Americans, Black people were primarily in the South up until the mid 20th century. And for many reasons, were trying to own the land which they once worked. In some cases, they got it, right? But due to Jim Crow policies, oppressive racist policies, the Great Migration, which brought people north to cities like Chicago or Detroit or places in the north, left that land there. Heirs were dispersed, right? And at that time, in the early 20th century, you couldn't just go to a town hall and get a will or work on a deed, right? And the USDA existed at that time, the United States Department of Agriculture, that was supposed to provide resources to help farmers hold on to land, deal with loans, deal with legal issues. But those decisions happened at the local level, and those local decision makers were super racist, right? These are the same people that were enacting other racist policies in other arenas. And so generationally, Black farmers were not able to get equal protection under the law, and so lost that land. In North Carolina alone, the land loss amounts to about $8.1 billion in today's value. Across the country, we're talking about $1 trillion of value tied to land that was lost over that time, land that was either reclaimed by communities on tax rolls, purchased by others, or other subversive techniques. $5 billion went to earmark those and compensate those families that were attempting to do that, of which they think about 300 to 400 million will actually go to dealing with it. $300 million versus $1 trillion in value. And that shows you the relationship between policy, land control and ownership, wealth accumulation, and the ability to pass that on to future generations. And again, these are federal policies. Minnie Fullilove Thompson, a friend, wrote a book called Root Shock. She's a psychiatrist, and she's studying the psychological impacts of losing one's home place. She focuses on what happened in the Hill District of Pittsburgh and what happened in the Bronx under Moses with urban renewal. And root shock is that psychological reaction to losing your home place. It unloads a cycle of trauma, right? Lack of security, a lack of the well-being and the understanding to invest and stay in place, especially if it happens in sequence, what she calls serial displacement. And she identifies eras where almost, particularly in the 20th century, every generation, there's a major policy that was federally funded that displaced Black and brown people. So going from slavery, but in the 20th century, urban renewal, planned shrinkage, impacts of mass incarceration, and today gentrification. So, there are real generational issues that we need to deal with, which led to strategies. If we have a situation where there might be low individual wealth, low levels of access to technical skills, low level of access to other tools to impact the landscape, how could we cooperate? How could we come together? And so cooperatives are as old as time. And there are many different kinds of cooperatives, not just one, ranging from consumer and credit cooperatives to production cooperatives, which are more popular with farmers and with agriculture. So we were looking at that as a component of the commons. Could cooperative ownership of land and property and of resources and information help with that? And of course, we weren't the first ones to think of it. Right? So W. DuBois, one of the great scholars, one of the pioneers of sociology, who in the early 20th century really was one of the first to survey African-American communities around the country about cooperatives and advocated for cooperative work to build scarce resources during Jim Crow to help Black communities kind of rise up, from grocery stores to farm collectives to consumer collectives to banks. There were many expressions of this. So at the time that he studied it in the early 20th century, there were over 6,000 of these around the country that are integrated into communities that we serve and we deal with. And this is just one of when we talk about cooperative grocery stores now, right, in a contemporary sense, this is an idea that was over 100 years old. With its legacy, for some people, who watch, stuff. So The Watchmen on HBO, right, which was the adaptation of the great graphic novel by Alan Moore, they decided to update the content of that piece. And the first episode is the bombing of Tulsa, Oklahoma, the Greenwood district. So, which resulted in dozens and dozens and dozens of deaths. But the racial hostility presented towards that particular community people thought it was fictional. They didn't believe that actually occurred. It actually did, right? And so I commend that connection of art to history in that regard. It's important to know that wasn't the only Black Wall Street, though. It's coined Black Wall Street, but there were others that were tied to this cooperative movement. One is closer to where I live in Durham, right? So Parrish Street, which was the home of Mechanics and Farmers Bank and NC Mutual Life Insurance Company, were both founded as cooperatives. And until the 1960s, those two companies were the largest employers of African Americans in the country. They were founded in the early 20th century, to the point where multiple generations of observers came and said, hey, the South is really messed up and racist, but y'all need to be more like Durham. So everyone from Du Bois to Booker T. Washington to Martin Luther King, generations later, Malcolm X, all came to this area and said, oh, this cooperative idea is a great idea. In terms of institution building and building businesses. So you'll find that there's a cooperative thread in a lot of these places that are at least 100 years old. And with land, the idea of a trust is not a 20th century idea. One of the first times that we hear like actual people talking about it is in reaction to Ebenezer Howard's Garden City theory, right, in England. So the idea of allotments that are associated with people to boost, to take the real estate and the economic pressures off of land and allow people to gain resources and the value of the resources grown off of it. But in the United States, although there are some community land trusts in the North, it really caught fire in the South. And this is Fannie Lou Hamer, renowned leader and civil rights activist from the Mississippi Freedom Movement, who proposed freedom farms, right, in Mississippi as a way to overcome the deep constraints of people's ability to own their own land, but the need for them to provide sustenance from that land and get profit from that they could use to better their lives. What's on the Wright was one of her inventions, which was the pig bank, right? So you get a pig, you mate the pig and get more pigs, and then you contribute the pigs that you're not using back to the bank so that someone else could use it, either for meat or for other reasons. So, early on, it's tied to the legacy of the civil rights movement, which many people think was political, but as it got further along, became economic. Some of these ideas got formalized, and so the emergence of the Schumacher Center, which codified community land trusts based on a model that was developed in Southwest Georgia. That was the first precedent that they used to encode the idea of a community land trust. So if you are working with a community land trust or aware of it, the precedent that unleashed that whole movement came from people who thought that the next wave in the civil rights movement was about land and property control and economic empowerment. The land trust operates on a pretty interesting model. Traditionally, you own the land and whatever is on it, right? It's a commodity. But in the land trust, it separates the land from what you're producing on it. The land goes into trust, perpetuity, in many cases for affordable housing, forever and ever and ever. But it could be a trust for almost anything. And it takes the capital costs down to make development on that land more affordable, and allows you to glean profit from whatever is produced on it, a structure, a crop, or other entities, for helping you lift yourself out of poverty, but also you give some back to keep the trust moving forward. So this idea for a landscape architect to say that land is not an economic commodity, that land is in common, that land is the setting where these things occur, and we need to gear ourselves towards how to leverage people who have modest means to find ways to move forward through what they produce on the land. It's a very different idea, right? It's carving out a bit of a communal attitude out of a capitalist one. One of the earliest urban land trusts was in Dudley Street, the Dudley Street Initiative, right? Which is profiled in this book, Streets of Hope, and really celebrates the impacts of Mel King, who's pictured on the right. And what's interesting about this is in Roxbury, and this is a time before Boston really kind of exploded on the scene. It's hard for some people to believe that major cities in the United States even went through this period because they're growing so quickly. But they kind of swooped in and intervened at a point when the city had neglected this part of town for many years. There wasn't a lot of development pressure, and decided that this organization would have the power to define a boundary within that city, to develop a communal landscape, and then to glean the profits off of what's done. It was the first moratorium on development in Boston's history, where they decided we're not going to allow any development to occur in this area until this group gets organized and decides what they want to do. So it's an incredible story that's yielded amazing benefits. So from housing, of course, in terms of affordable housing, business opportunities, and now greenhouses and food production, it's expanded and expanded and expanded. And in many ways is the template that many people use today. What's interesting is even historically, these kinds of things converge in different ways. So Rondo, which is in Minnesota and St. Paul, African-American community in St. Paul, that had cooperatives, right? So they took the playbook directly from DuBois to learn how to build and leverage collective wealth historically in the 20th century, but unfortunately were targeted for urban renewal, and the freeway, I-94, was sliced right through their particular community. Well, they started with cooperatives historically and then moved to a land trust that was built around the area to reclaim parts of that damage done in the freeway, to elevate historical businesses and talk about cultural legacy. They have executed projects. This is one of their information and heritage centers that was professionally designed, that talks about the story of the community and the value of the cooperatives. It provides public space for people to organize, and even grander plans now of now pushing back on the damage done on the freeway and advocating for a cap, right, that will allow for a place for redevelopment within the boundaries of the land trust, and heal the wounds that were done in the mid-20th century. We'll end with some digital examples of the commons, or the speculation of the commons. And so, if you're like me and you were on your phone over the last year, you probably saw this guy, So D Nice, was funny that my mother didn't know who this was, because I played a lot of D Nice records when I was in college, connected with KRS-One and Boogie Down Productions, but who has made a resurgence. And what he decided to do was Club Quarantine. Hey, if everybody's at home. They still need to feel good and still need to feel connected, and started to do DJ sets on Instagram, right? And so this thing erupts in popularity. This is the one that was dedicated to Michelle Obama, First Lady. But this idea, it's seen as sort of a fringe entertainment thing. But, you know, as we start to focus on the full healing process, dealing with trauma and dealing with a lot of the challenge that we face, we know that music is a healer, that art is a healer, that convening even on the screen can be a healer, that there's a spiritual component to this, and that even though we're dispersed, we can feel like we're together. So this was really fascinating, you know, and it's been on my mind a lot as we started to grapple with the challenges of the day. The Green New Deal, an offshoot of the New Deal, but with major modifications, leading to the Green New Deal Super Studio, which we've been coordinating through the Landscape Architecture Foundation in a virtual environment. So I'm sure there are a number of you that are part of this now. We thank you for that participation. We have thousands of students who are currently working on this work. And it may sound unsatisfactory, but I'll say that, you know, in many cases, our institutions compete, right? So the idea that we cloister you and don't let you interact with other students and other faculty. This has been an opening in some ways. So some of those silos where for the first time, you know, our students are interacting with people from all over the country. We had a super crit about 2 weeks ago that had over 100 people on it in 7 universities, and people who normally wouldn't talk, offering their ideas, their thinking, like in good faith, investing in this next generation. So this technological innovation has some potential, and it's extended, right? So this is a good friend, Justin Garrett Moore, now at the Mellon Foundation, formerly public design director for the city of New York, but from Indianapolis, Indiana, and multi-generational connections to the land, and has taken the online and crowdsourcing idea to another extreme, where now you can crowdsource and invest online in equitable urban revitalization projects through a program called Urban Patch. It started small with gardens and streetscapes. It's grown up to attracting the first grocery store and bodega in an underserved neighborhood, literally crowdsourced by thousands of people around the world, in some cases who've never had any contact with where they are, but are tied to the mission. In a sense, grown up to Rwanda. And he sent some notes last week saying, hey, I'm getting back from Rwanda. And I was like, during quarantine, are you crazy? They're building affordable housing in Rwanda. And not only that, but they've been able to crowdsource the investment and the community to learn how to build, to design, and become certified, so that after this project's over, there's a whole cohort of people who can continue and can build their lifestyle around building, all through the digital commons. None of these people ever met. It was all done online. So there are incredible opportunities ahead of us that doesn't take the place of in-person work, but it's to say that we don't have to worry about that as much as we do. It's an opportunity. I'll close with a plug for the organization I serve as president-elect for, and say that it's a resource for you all. We, in fact, were the funders of the fellowship that helped Pamela Conrad develop the Pathfinder tool. So that investment, everyone is benefiting from. And we're very happy to create those opportunities for folks. And we are part of COP26 too. So we're very serious organizationally about climate change. And for the students, we provide over $100,000 of scholarships every year. We encourage you to go and apply. And when you look at the Olmsted Scholars, we're really excited about next year because we have over 900 Olmsted Scholars now and counting. There are probably several who are on this call to celebrate leadership that's pointing us in a new direction. So between Divine's incredible work interpreting cultural landscapes in her home in Africa, to David Hooper dealing with veterans issues and helping people rehabilitate and recommit to society. We like to think that we put our money where our mouth is, and we want to support positive change. So with that, I'll say thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Great. Thank you so much, Kofi, for such an amazing talk. We do have some questions here in the Q&A. So just as a reminder to use the Q&A feature on Zoom if you want to submit your question. I'll just start with this first one. So more of a general question about you, Kofi. So do you have any personal heroes, either in landscape architecture or not? How have they helped you move through your career and life?
That's a really good question. I have maybe too many heroes to count. It sounds sort of cliche, but of course my mother is number one. My mother was a professional artist. Her father was a self-trained artist. So my mother was one of the first people in our family to graduate from college. My grandfather was too poor to go to college. And so he had a desire for art and creativity, but he had to figure it out on his own, which was difficult. So in two generations, I'm very proud to now be an academic in the university. When, 2 generations ago, we couldn't even go. But the point I want to make with my mother is that there was, and this is a story you may enjoy, is when I was 2, I got caught drawing on the wall. I don't know if any of you all got busted like that, right? So I did it discreetly behind a door that was open, hoping it would shield it. So I drew all the stuff on the wall. So my mother comes in, and instead of getting mad, she pulls out some fabric and teaches me how to make a mural. And we sit there on the floor and learn how to make a mural. And I think about that point where there are folks who have that impetus, like I actually want to do some stuff, I want to make some stuff, and how we're either punished or discouraged or derailed. And I really credit that moment of intercepting that energy, redirecting it to a constructive purpose to keep me on the track I am here. So I would say Mom. There are professionals, of course. Walter was a hero when I was in college. It's an honor to know him as a colleague now. I'm inspired by many. So, but I'll stick with those 2 for now.
Okay, thank you so much, Kofi. Another question we have here is, can you explain more about the African-American contribution to Middleton Place Gardens? And so not the rice plantation, the butterfly lake, sweeping terraces, et cetera, seem to be designed in a French style.
Yes. So there's 2 ways to answer this question. I'll do the most expansive one first. One thing I learned going to Charleston was due to malaria, there were extended periods when in many cases, there were no white people on the plantation grounds, that the enslaved African people were working independently because they're afraid of malaria. So I would say that the design of the grounds definitely are French. The owner of Middleton Place intentionally contracted designers at that time to replicate that. The purpose of the butterfly lakes and the terrace was the desired entry in Middleton Place was actually from the river, right? So we wanted this grand entry for people who were coming, sort of shock and awe as they proceeded up. So the broader version is that there were extended periods when there were no Europeans or white folks there. And so even though it was executing someone else's design who actually figured it out, were African people. But the other side is, and I have a colleague, Gray Gundaker, who's written pretty extensively about this, is why we separate the productive side of the plantation from the decorative side. Without the rice, there would be no wealth to enable the development of that showpiece of a place. And so although it's separated, right, in terms of its form, like the rice plantations has a totally different organization, totally different pattern, economically and politically and socially and culturally, they're deeply connected. So the African people definitely led the construction of the dikes, the construction of the drainage systems, the whole process of that part of the food system, and had a very strong role in there. But my argument is that Middleton Place's framing should be inclusive of both, not just the decorative garden part, but the productive economic part as well.
Thank you. So our next question is on racialized topography. How has this been addressed in landscape architecture design, or is it being addressed?
It's a good question. And for people who are from other regions, you should know that that idea was very specific to the Southeast. So it'd be interesting to see if that pattern works in other regions with other geographies and other issues. So it's not attempting to generalize that phenomenon. It's very specific to where we are. In our case, and what I did not show in the slides were, in particular in Raleigh with Walnut Creek, in the aftermath of Hurricane Floyd, the residents there pushed back. It was actually the birth of their first environmental justice organization, so named in Raleigh, at least, Partners for Environmental Justice, who pushed back on the city, who was doing some unfair things with regards to repairs and flood damage, but also went further and said, hey, maybe one of the things we need to do is, our community is on the most substantial forested wetland closest to downtown. This should be a show place. And then because of the cultural legacy of Rochester Heights, it's an opportunity to celebrate the cultural history as well. And so a gentleman by the name of Dr. Norman Camp, who was the leader of Partners for Environmental Justice, started to champion this idea of a wetland education center and this idea of a wetland education park. And sort of through his coalition of partners, successfully advocated for a bond issue that paid for both. And so today there is a wetland education center. The wetland education park is almost completed. And when it receives tens of thousands of visitors every year. And the mission of those particular entities is to talk about why urban wetlands are important, what their function and role is in the watershed, but also the cultural legacy of the people who've had to grapple with being in that area. So that's a local example. There are others that we could get into.
Great, thank you so much for sharing that. And our next question is, how do landscape architects take the lead on addressing the needs of those living in low-income neighborhood? How does Kofi envision landscape architecture stepping up to enable real change in this area? So what would be step one on your plan?
We don't lead. So I'd like to offer an alternative phrasing of that question. I think, and this is controversial, but I think in some cases, the term architecture complicates some of our work. There's a bias and a connotation associated with a lot of architecture, big cape flaining superhero that comes in and saves the day, that has the ideas of how to deal with an issue fully formed in their brain. It's just a matter of getting these little peons to follow in line and follow that plan, right? When what we know now is that community people know a lot. What they may not know is vocabulary, the language. They may not have access to information to understand systems. We play multiple roles in addition to the beautiful design at the end. So what I would offer is we could do a lot more to build the capacity of communities who don't know who we are. For people who are in landscape architecture, you already know. For students, don't be afraid of this, but you'll discover that most people think you're a gardener or a landscaper. They don't understand that you deal with infrastructure, you deal with land use, you deal with urban design, you deal with all these factors. And every time we interact with people, we are ambassadors of our profession, right? We have to introduce people to the value that we add in multiple arenas. And part of that is, I think, listening, like taking a step back and critically listening to what people are saying and what their issues are, and aligning what they are talking about and what their interests are with information, with study, and with information that helps us turn that and connect that to actual projects that support that. And I think we could do a much better job at that, of co-creating, of working together collaboratively. We need resources to be able to do that. All the resources right now, particularly in traditional practice, are you have to demonstrate a certain level of expertise, that you've done something 10 times to get selected, and then you get the money and then you do it. But I think we need another parallel process. It's always about community education. It's always about the value that we can add, the access to information that we know, the legacy that they've left behind, our appreciation of that. Because I think from that you get solutions that when you leave, they continue, right? That people understand them, they occupy them, they value them, they talk about them. So that would be a version of an answer to that question.
Great, thank you. And actually one of our co-hosts has a question, but they're not allowed to use the Q&A function, so he sent me in the chat. As your Black Landscapes Matter article primarily focuses on landscapes in your home of North Carolina, how can we expand these ideas to learn and acknowledge the Black landscapes within each of our own cities and neighborhoods? Are there research methods, databases, or approaches you recommend in understanding the Black histories of our homes?
That's a great question. They vary. I want to salute a colleague and a friend, Dr. Andrea Roberts, who's at Texas A&M now, who has an incredible, remarkable center that focuses on documenting settlements, historically Black settlements in Texas. And she's developing a really robust methodology, a mixed method methodology for documenting them. So some of it is sort of painful. It's going through archives and deeds and records. Some of it is geospatial, you know, in terms of mapping where these things happen to be. And some of it is oral history. So going to places and having conversations and documenting them. So it's a mixed method kind of way. But I think that, you know, there are legacies of institutions in many cities, and they, in some ways, are points of continuity. So schools, universities, businesses and business districts. There are things that have had a presence for a period of time that are often documented in other areas. So they'll be in a history book, they'll be in an anthropology book, they'll be in an archaeology book, you know. So, but when you start to then think about the landscape components of them, you have to be able to translate some of those other resources into the language of landscape. So I would say maybe start with institutions, maybe consider mixed method tools but I think it's important to mark them, to map them, to document them, and to layer.
Great, thank you. So the next question we have is, what advice do you have for those of us entering the field who come from underrepresented communities?
Graduate. So it's going to be hard. I know for me, my first year in MLA program went pretty easy. I hate to say that, but we were learning design fundamentals and ecological systems, and I just had an affinity for that particular information. Once I got to the end of my first year, I started to lose interest and lose sort of enthusiasm for the work. And another hero of mine I should talk about now, because this was the intervention that changed my life. Then Department Chair Ken Polakowski was on sabbatical my first year, but in the second year decided, after he got back from sabbatical, that not only was he going to be my advisor, but to tell me in front of my whole class I was lazy. So it's the second time you've heard lazy today from two different professors, right? He's like, yeah, you're not working hard enough. I heard what you did in the last year. You were slacking off. And I was like, what? You know, I was in my mind, like, you know, it wasn't relevant to what I was experiencing outside the classroom. I didn't have a firm grasp of what landscape architecture was. So he literally gave me twice as much work as everybody else for a year. But at the end of that, wrote a recommendation letter for an internship at Carroll Johnson Associates. And that's how I got to Cambridge for my internship, which I think was the thing that cemented me committing to landscape architecture. And that's the advice that I would give to you, is to get a perspective of landscape architecture outside of school. Because of COVID and other things, it's harder to get an internship and harder to get to new environments. But I came from Detroit, great landscape, but not the same as Boston and Cambridge, right? So for the first time in my life, I'm taking transit or riding the T. I'm on the Charles River and walking the Emerald Necklace. I'm really that experiential learning of understanding why these things matter, like why design matters, why grading matters, right? So often in school, it's easy to lose our way because we think it's all theoretical, hypothetical, or from a very narrow lens, right? But I think that lived experience of understanding how that applies. And then when I came back, right, comparing that experience to my experience growing up in Detroit and understanding the disparities, like immediately, and that landscape architecture could play a role, it gave me a mission. So my third year was really fast, right? And I was able to persuade my advisors to take on a project in my own hometown, right? So I was able to actually deploy what I'd learned there. So what I would say to folks who are grappling with it now, the first one is to get an experience of the landscape outside of school, right? And it may not be an internship, but it could just be taking walks in famous places. It could be visiting with offices, even virtually. It could be experiencing other things. And the second thing I would say is to continue to work on the craft, right? Because it's about the excellence in the application of the craft, no matter what goes on. And if you can define the issue that you want to apply it to, but you need to be really good at it. So don't lose sight of the value of the skills that we have. Don't get frustrated because you're not able to apply them in the immediate circumstance, the issues that most compel you and reach out beyond the walls of the university to get other experiences.
Thank you so much, Kofi. So we have some people upvoting some of these questions. The next one I'll read is, what memorials would you like to see built and where should they be sited? Also, which memorials should you like to see removed and where should they go?
Wow, this is going to be a very long keynote. My colleague and I are currently editing a book called Empty Pedestals that is addressing the aftermath of the removal of Confederate monuments, particularly in the Southeast. And we're grappling with this question right now. What does memorialization and monumentality really mean, right? We've got a really amazing array of contributors, both from the academic side in terms of framing it, and then the practitioner side, like actual people who are engaged in this particular thing. So, you know, there are extremes to it. I'll cite two that are interesting. One is from good friends Brian Lee and Sue Mobley, co-locate in Monuments Lab. They developed paper monuments in New Orleans. The Paper Monuments Project was done in the aftermath of the removal of Confederate monuments, literally in the middle of the night by then Mayor Landrieu in New Orleans. And what do you do with those places? And so what they did was they used those places, gathering spaces, and invited people to share local stories of other histories that were just as important that occurred in and around the sites that were previously Confederate monuments. And so this idea of ritual, of gathering, of use, and then proposing high impact, short-term ways of communicating that value. And they decided to go with posters and other graphic components, and then to solicit crowdsourced ideas of what people wanted to see there, and then combine those into proposals that they then gave to city council as alternatives there. But in their mind, and on that end of the extreme, it's about people, it's about engagement, it's ephemeral, it's not permanent, you know. And so that's, I think, in line with how a lot of people in other parts of the world see memorialization. It's not the artifact or that space, it's the coming together, it's the shared meaning, it's the exchange, right? The other extreme, we get to the Equal Justice Initiative in Alabama, the great work of the folks there, and Mass Design Group, who essentially took the theme of the Acropolis from Greece, but translated it into a monument that honored the deaths of African-American people by lynching. And that one is definitely meant to be permanent, and it evokes a sense of permanence. The whole metaphor, like the way you approach this thing and you move through. The columns, in this case, are symbolic gestures representing the strange fruit, as Billie Holiday referenced in her song of African Americans hanging from trees. It's a very traumatic experience, meant to evoke that traumatic experience, right? Meant to force an emotional reaction to understand the horror that has occurred. So those represent, I think, the two extremes, right? One is the permanent artifact that is in a way didactic, right? That's sort of a teaching place that is about the horrors of some things, or if it's a different kind of memorial, the joys of it, right? The other one is less intensive, but more about encouraging other people to contribute their stories, to build relationships, to build a social network and a ritual to reclaim those spaces. So I think those represent the poles. I haven't identified where I fall on it yet. But those represent the extremes.
Great, thank you. Our next question is, along the lines of racial topography, does it go further than Black communities, such as Native American communities and many others?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I think that with the indigenous communities and Native communities in the United States, land loss has a whole different connotation. And so Pierre Belanger, who actually also was an LAF fellow, his work was No Design on Stolen Land. And his opinion was that if you don't know the treaties that underlie the landscapes that you work on, and if you haven't established a relationship with indigenous communities, you should not proceed. right? And it's really interesting because that's not something that's in our protocols, right? I'm pretty sure most people don't even know, the treaties that are impacted by the land that they're on. Removal of Native Americans, Trail of Tears, which impacts where we are in the Southeast even today, where the Cherokee, I'm going to concede my ignorance for a second. When I was in school, like elementary, middle school, I always thought they were a Western and Plains group of people. They were not. They're from the mountains, North Carolina and Tennessee and those places, right? So the fact that those people were made to walk, not even that they were displaced, but they were made to walk that great distance and completely transform their lifestyle to a brand new landscape. But just the compounding levels of injustice are almost too much to bear. But I would say that I think Pierre's on to something with regards to being aware if there are any agreements and to initiate a relationship with Indigenous communities if you want to make a change. And I think the second part, which was hinted at in the early acknowledgments, which I liked a great deal, was land grant institutions, of which we are one as well, NC State. And it's been recently revealed that what helped create the resources to fund the land grant institutions was the value of the land that was confiscated from Indigenous people. That institutions like us that are charged with making access to information a bit more democratic, right? That's what the Morrill Act was about. It's about education for the people, some people, it's another conversation, but not the elite, right? So the fact that they focus on agriculture and technology and engineering, like that's our common kind of thread, was because they were like, these are the skills we need to kind of build the country. That's seen as, in contemporary sense, that's great, right? And land grant institutions have an engagement mission, right? It's baked into what we do. We can't just hide out in our ivory towers and work. We have to make our work relevant to the issues of our region. All great things, but we're all grappling with that legacy now of the fact that in our origins, it was based on the exploitation of Native people. So I think that there are Indigenous people everywhere. We have not identified a pattern. I know where we are, the Lumbee, which I think are the largest, I would say federally unrecognized group of Indigenous people in the country, near Lumberton on the Lumber River. Many of them are in the floodplain. Many of them are in the low ground of the Lumber River, which they consider Black River, and there's a whole story with that. But the point being that in our local circumstance, it varies. It's not as succinct as what we're dealing with.
Great, thank you, Kofi. So another one of our co-hosts has a question for you. His question is, in tonight's presentation and in Black Landscapes Matter, you encouraged us to expand the frame of landscape architectural practices. What advice do you have for educators in tonight's session to decenter design curriculums from Western European precedents?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, I think that in reflection, it was more speculative. It wasn't with an end game in mind, but the idea that we need to do it, not knowing what we need to do. So this sounds unfair and gray and academic, but when I wrote it, I didn't have a preconceived notion of what that was. But now with distance, as I'm observing people attempting to respond to it, there are different approaches, right? So I think one is how we teach history. How we describe the story of landscape architecture to our students. I don't know about you all, but when I took landscape history at Michigan, very unsatisfying. We basically memorized slides. So every week we had like a quiz and they'd be like, what's that? And you're like, oh, that's some random French garden. Click, what's that? Oh, that's some random Italian garden, right? So it was sort of like this memorization of the artifact, right? And the implication with how we teach history is a trickle down approach, right? Where you learn where these forms came from, and then you adapt those forms, essentially hybridize, combine them to your current situation, which in a way kind of perpetuates a favoring of the logic and the organization of different communities, right? And it's not to say that I don't like French landscapes. I love French landscapes. I love English landscapes. They're great. But we don't often tell the full story of it, right? So the Middleton Place example is a really interesting one. Why would you build a French garden in South Carolina. You know, unless you're trying to impress people who understood French culture. There's nothing intuitively or explicitly appropriate for that. One thing that Frederick Olmsted was criticized for, and rightfully so, was canonizing the English pastoral landscape. No matter which ecosystem or which region you're in, rolling hills, grass, and informal clumps of trees and spaghetti paths is landscape architecture. That's not because it's the best way to solve those problems or if it's even most ecologically appropriate. It's because we parrot and model what we learn, right? And as we start to deal with particularly climate change and adaptation and how our planet is changing, I think we have to be more creative, and we have to be more sophisticated at reading the unique qualities of the places we operate. And I think that will be enriched if our vocabulary were broader, right? And we really learned about how landscapes were transformed by communities that had to deal with real constraints, right? Like it was not for fashion or leisure, it was life or death. You know, we would benefit from knowing how those landscapes helped with accruing political power and a stronger voice, or helped with accumulating wealth in communities that didn't, right? It's hard to find the landscapes of man, right? The Jellicoe series. Don't even talk about that. So I think history is a good way to start because it forces us to then think about our lineage and our history and what we really want to communicate to the next generation. And I think there's some people who are really grappling with that. So Tyson Way's work at Dumbarton Oaks is an example. There are many others who are really critically looking at that story that we're choosing to tell and pass along and really thinking about who's in that story and who's not. So there are others, but those are some that come to mind.
Great, thank you, Kofi. So we have time for maybe one more question. If anyone else has questions for the Q&A feature, maybe I'll wait just a moment. And thank you everyone for your questions. Really great questions tonight. Okay, I think we can wrap it up then. Thank you so much, Kofi, for your amazing talk tonight and opening up our conference this weekend. And before we end today's session, I'd just like to make a few announcements, if that's okay. Unless you wanted to share anything else, Kofi?
Oh, I just wanted to again say thank you. I hope that some of the topics were provocative. I hope that you all have an amazing few days. I salute you all. Again, for creating a forum to have these conversations. I'm looking forward to the closing remarks from Diane and Austin, who are good friends, and everything in between. So I commend you on organizing a great conference. Thank you very much.